Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is awake with your first coffee in hand and ready to be able to enjoy some discussion. And then a little bit later, towards the end of the session, we're actually going to have a little coffee break time as well. So you can have your second coffee then. So that's when you get prepared to have your second, or maybe some of you, it's your third coffee for the morning. But following this session, we'll have a little coffee break where not only some of these presenters, but other members of who are involved in that conference, as well as people from Ryerson and other areas will join in, and you can have a chat with folks and reflect on what you've heard, since we all know that that milling about thing you do after the conference panel we can't really replicate. So they have been very conscientious in planning this conference to give some space for that sort of more informal chats. So you can look forward to having your second coffee together, hopefully. Okay, so I see that we've had quite a number of people join in. Just waiting one more second here. Let's see. Great, we have lots of people have joined so far. I'll start maybe by just briefly introducing myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Hennebree. I'm from Wilfrid Laurier University, and I have been doing work on migration in Canada and the globe for 15 some odd years. And I'm quite happy to be involved today in the role as the chair of this exceptional panel. And the plan for today is to have some really interesting engagement with some speakers around thinking around the gig economy, the platform, the new tech, all the things that when I say, my mother goes, what do you mean? But when I was thinking about them and reading this exceptional work that you're going to hear a little bit more detail about from the speakers, I was thinking about, well, you know, we've got this massive technological change. We have this massive social cultural shift where more and more people are living their lives online, which we know has been, you know, exacerbated or amped up, whichever perspective you want to take in the context of COVID, right? But we also have a expansion of the needs to supply that sector, to prop that sector up. And in my own work, I know that my web designer is running around like crazy trying to do all the work that I need done. And I think, you know, when we think about this particular sector, it is sort of the ultimate of flexibility. It's the ultimate flexible form of employment. And some of the things that you'll hear about today in the panel from the panelists will talk about some of those shifts, the fact that there's potentially less barriers for entry into that sector than there would be to other types of more formalized employment, but also the double-edged sword, right? The precarity that comes from being engaged in that more flexible sector. And we know that quite historically that migrants are concentrated in those sectors that are more flexible, in those sectors that have more precarious employment. And so we're going to talk about how these new realities drive with our immigration policy. Do they align with it? Are there benefits from the way in which things are governed around immigration? How does this new reality or these realities connect with labor policy, thinking about issues around labor rights and social protections, pensions, unionizations, right? All of these types of issues I hope we'll get in today. So the speakers that we have up first, we have a whole range of them. So we have here today, and forgive me because I'll probably mispronounce a name, so just up front, and if I've said it wrong, I meant to check this morning and I forgot, but please do correct me if I've said it wrong. So we have Niels van Doorn and Darsana Vijay. They'll be talking about constructing a platform-governed migrant division of labor. They're both from the University of Amsterdam. And Niels is an assistant professor in new media and digital culture. And he's leading the Platform Labor Research Project funded by the European Research Council. Maybe he can tell you a little bit more about that in questions. Darsana Vijay is a research assistant on the Platform Labor Project, and she has a master's degree in media studies from the University of Amsterdam. So following that very interesting presentation, we're also going to hear from Karen McCallum, who is from the University of London. But she's got degrees from Waterloo and McMaster, so she's got some Canadian roots or Canadian connections, and she'll be talking to us about labor and economic justice and issues around the case that she's looking at, which is on a different document, and I want to make sure I say it right. Sorry about that. She'll be talking about the gig work and really thinking about it as precarious work. Thank you for that. This is the trouble of doing these things online. And we'll also hear from Laura Lamb, who's a PhD student at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at U of T. And she's also a researcher with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration. So she works with Dr. Triandafyllidou. I'm going to say it wrong. I said it wrong, even though I practiced this morning. How do I say it properly, Anna?
You said it fine, Triandafyllidou.
Oh, good. I was close. I figured phonetic was the way to go, and I've heard it said so many times, and I've known you on and off for years, and I still say it wrong. I apologize for that. If it was in Spanish, no trouble, but sorry. Who's a Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson. So we're going to hear from these exceptional folks, and I'm going to first turn it over right now to Niels van Doorn and Darsana Vijay. Please go ahead, Niels.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Also on behalf of Darsana, I'll do the presentation. We'll both be available, of course, for answering questions and discussion. Thanks for having us as media scholars kind of interlope in this migration conference. I hope that some of the stuff that we have to say interests you, maybe provokes you, angers you, or inspires you. Either way, we'd love to hear from you afterwards. So I'm just going to share my screen and start, because I think I need all the time that is allotted to me. So there we go. I'm going to do this and then this. So I assume you can see what I'm seeing now. Oh, and finally, I'll be reading most of the time. I know that has certain drawbacks, but it will hopefully allow me to make our points as clearly as possible, and also stick somewhat to the time frame, to the time constraints. So the title of the presentation, as you can see, is Gig Work as Migrant Work, the Platformization of Migration Infrastructure. So we changed our title. So there we go. So what drives, and this is the opening question that we start with, that we started our research with, what drives gig economies around the world? What factors may account for their growth? It is our contention that with markets concentrating predominantly in and around large cities, gig platforms across the globe depend as much on the labor of migrants and minorities as on investment capital and permissive governments. And by the way, when we talk about gig economies here, we're talking about local serving gig economy. So especially food delivery, cleaning, ride hailing, not virtual or digital labor like Upwork, etc. We're focusing on local markets. The movement of people within and across borders in search of work and better future is in this way a critical condition ensuring the existence of urban gig economies. There's thus an urgent need to center migrant experiences and the role of migrant labor in gig economy research, that's kind of our field of study, in order to generate a better understanding of how gig work offers certain opportunities and challenges to migrants with a variety of backgrounds and skill levels. So what makes migrants try their luck on gig platforms despite the well-documented precarity of gig work? And how do they incorporate these platforms into their everyday lives and migration trajectories? And then additionally, it is important to investigate the role of gig platforms as emerging actors in the political economy of migration as a result of how they mediate migrant mobilities. So very briefly about our study, which is embedded in a larger platform labor research project that I don't have the time to talk about now. So the platform labor study is a cross-national comparative study of gig economies in Amsterdam, Berlin, and New York City. We did 8 months of ethnographic fieldwork in each city. And our focus then, as you will see, is on app-based domestic cleaning and food delivery. So that's also where our contentions and arguments and speculations come from, of course, which are, again, is limited and situated, but we can see how much it resonates across industries and sectors. So I did all in all 151 semi-structured interviews in Amsterdam with 12 cleaners, 28 couriers, of which 32 were migrants. Berlin, 25 cleaners, 30 couriers, 48 of which in total were migrants. And in New York City, it was different. It was 22 cleaners, 34 couriers, only 6 of which I interviewed were migrants, but that has to had very much to do with also language limitations there, particularly me not speaking Spanish and Chinese. This is something that I don't have time to go into now, but we could definitely talk about later. But in my fieldwork, I did notice that, like Amsterdam and Berlin and elsewhere, these industries were very much populated and dominated by immigrants. So then we should say that in this paper, we move beyond the existing parameters of gig economy research by engaging with 2 strands of literature on migration and migrant labor that are particularly useful for framing our analysis. First of all, the autonomy of migration research. And again, I'm going through this a bit fast because I'm sure this audience knows all about this. So, but just to be sure, autonomy of migration is really important. It centers around migrant agency, and it combines that with a focus on global flows of labor, capital, and transformations of capitalism more global, more generally. And then the other one is migration infrastructure, more recent perspective from anthropology mainly, is focusing on Southeast Asia mainly, that would focus on the middle space of migration, so the intermediaries that shape and move migrant mobility. So building on these approaches, we argue that gig platforms are now part of a multitude of platforms of arrival and takeoff within, against, and beyond the infrastructure of the state. Compared to other types of actors that select, give direction to, and retain or accelerate certain migratory subjects, to quote them one more time, platform companies are less beholden to the state than to international finance capital, which affords them relatively more leeway to engage in regulatory arbitrage. Still, it would be mistaken to blame the gig economy's predatory practices, because we do see them as predatory practices, on the state's inability to govern it. Gig platforms do not just operate against and beyond the state, they navigate within its regulatory purview and respond to the racialized and gendered logics of subordination, stratification, and exclusion embedded in existing laws and policies. Accordingly, they generate new chances and risks for migrant workers whose mobility is often regimented and or curtailed, resulting in the formation of an app-based alternative to, or extension of, we're not quite sure whether we should see it as an extension of or an alternative to, existing infrastructure mediating processes of migration and arrival. Now, in our paper, we document the narratives and the trajectories of multiple migrants. Here, we focus briefly on only one because we don't have much time, of course. So we focus on Natalia. She's 39. She's a Brazilian, now living in Berlin. Or actually, right now she's living in London, but at the time she was living in Berlin. So when, and I'm sorry for not giving her more background, more history, but the time doesn't allow for it. So when none of her applications resulted when she was in Berlin in a callback and rent was due, she decided to respond to one of Helpling. Helpling is a cleaning platform in Berlin and other countries. One of the many Helpling ads she had seen while participating in Berlin-focused Facebook groups. She was surprised that the company did not meet with her in person and expected very little from her in terms of documentation or work experience. But far from jumping at this low threshold income opportunity, as many others did that I interviewed, Helpling felt like a last-ditch option to Natalia, who considered the idea of cleaning people's homes deeply unappealing. So, oh, sorry, that's now the first quote comes. Within myself, I was feeling horrible to be cleaning someone else's foyer. I was a spoiled white woman from Brazil cleaning other people's, like I saw like the tables in all the office tables and I was like, I should be sitting there. So she quit right after that first cleaning and returned to Brazil, disillusioned and depressed, as she'd called it. Still, she did not delete her account because she wanted to hold open the possibility of coming back to Berlin. And she knew that Helpling would offer another time a quick way to pay her rent. 2 months later already, she was back. And this time she pushed herself to get over her misgivings and try again. And that's the second quote you see here. It was a switch in the middle of like, I was studying about women all the time back in Brazil. She did women's studies. And we are so like patronizing, talking about poor women, poor women, they have to do this, and they should be saved, I was so white, it was so white privilege, and then I realized I'm not white. I have no privilege and I can't find a job in my area. So yeah, that's what I have to do. So then the realization that she was no longer white in Berlin, because the privileges associated with whiteness were not available to her there, made her painfully aware not only of her own racialized class identity, because she grew up upper middle class, but also of her condescension towards poor women of color doing domestic work. Well, only once she stopped pitying these women, could she stop pitying herself and do what was necessary to survive in a foreign city. And she started working a lot more. And then it took Natalia many months to find out that her required paperwork was not in order, and that she had in fact been working illegally for the entire period, even though Helpling didn't notify her and allowed her to service customers. A roommate eventually explained to her that in Germany, self-employed workers can only obtain a Gewerbeschein, which is a business license, after they complete an in-person Anmeldung, which is an address registration, at an office of the Berlin municipality. So then she said, and then I realized I never did it properly because I thought that you could file online. I really honestly thought it was everything like here in Germany, right? Like things should be online, because even in Brazil, you can do that kind of stuff online. And I sent them, so Helpling, the document that I filled, and they said, okay, you're good to go. So apparently the fact that the completed online documents Natalia submitted were only the first step towards obtaining a Gewerbeschein did not matter to Helpling, whose negligence put her in a vulnerable position. Not having a proper business license meant not having a tax ID, which meant that she wasn't on the radar of Berlin's tax office. And as she said, I didn't have anything. So for the government, I don't exist. So now the question is, how is Natalia able to work in these circumstances? So drawing on their research on the employment agents recruiting migrant domestic workers in Singapore, we and colleagues highlight the essential work of translation that these intermediaries engage in. They contend that, and you see the quote here, the purpose of brokerage is not to automate, quicken, or replicate processes, but to bring together and activate the overlapping regulatory frameworks and dominant social cultural modes of understanding that underpin the transnational migration industry, end of quote. We find it interesting to think about such claims in the context of companies like Helpling, which would deny any link to transnational migration industries and persistently avoid being identified as employment or staffing agencies. Indeed, such disavowals explain the restricted translation work provided by these platforms, which customarily actually, as you see in the quote, automate, quicken, or replicate processes that would otherwise require more effort and knowledge. So while Helpling and other platform companies do offer migrants workers basic information about regulatory frameworks, required paperwork, they stop short of ensuring that those who are onboarded indeed understand and comply with existing laws and requirements. Because Helpling does not see personalized explication and compliance monitoring as its responsibility, migrants like Natalia can get into legal trouble with the German government, whose misclassification of Helpling as a platform and of Natalia as self-employed sanctions the former's labor casualization and the latter's precarity. We should therefore, view Natalia's situation as co-produced by the German state's ongoing institutionalization of precarity, which has a particularly negative impact on migrants and other labor market outsiders. So, and then we go to kind of when the time that she was thinking about moving to London. As she indeed eventually did move to London, migrants may switch platforms. The gig economy will continue to provide transitional opportunities that sustain the aspirations and trajectories of migrants like Natalia. This is because gig platforms form plug-and-play arrival infrastructures, offering immediate income streams that can function as financial stopgaps and potentially also a stepping stone to something better. You will see that in another presentation as well. But due to their mix of accessibility and generative entrenchment, they also have a penchant to ensnare migrants who already face structural barriers to the labor market and welfare provisions of host countries. So in other words, it's easier to access a gig platform than to leave it again. And leave it for what? What does it take to graduate from the gig and move on to something more sustainable and rewarding? Helpling may have lost its appeal among members of Natalia's migrant social circle and among her, her See It, Hates It. But as she notes, there are always Brazilians on the Facebook group that she follows saying, oh, I'm looking for a job. I accept anything. I can be a cleaner, I can do babysitting, this and that. I think that happens a lot in London too, but I found it really interesting to see that when someone puts up like this job app today that she recently found that she wanted to use in London when she got there, people go nuts. Because as long as there's better alternatives, there are few better alternatives and migrants are, in one of our other participants' words, desperate for work, platform labor will feel like a step up rather than down. And because it promises to lift them out of their supplicant position and circuits of informality, even as the gig economy reproduces many of the most pressing problems associated with informal labor markets. So now we get to our conclusion. As our research demonstrates, gig economy companies capture disaggregated migrant labor and render it productive not only through highly regimented and regulated supply chains, as in like in migration industry, but via relatively open yet platform governed marketplaces where millions of ultra short-term, namely gig-based contracts stipulate the risk and responsibilities of service requesters and service providers. So as such, we say that we claim that gig companies accelerate the multiplication of labor, as Mazatra and Nielsen have called it, and deploy new strategies for its valorization. Importantly, and now we get to the migrant division of labor, this simultaneously results in labor's renewed segmentation through what we identify as an emerging app-based migrant division of labor. And we refer to May's work on this also in the London context. Despite being differently positioned in terms of class, race, gender, and legal status, in our research, we found that migrants are increasingly taking up precarious gig work, just like they previously accepted and continue to accept racialized and feminized service jobs with low pay and little protection. So then combining the conceptual lenses of the autonomy of migration and migration infrastructure approaches enables us to bring into focus this app-based migrant division of labor and situate its emergence within a broader development, namely that of the platformization of migration infrastructure. That's what we would call it. Migrants do not just use social media platforms to support and plan their migration trajectories, they also increasingly turn to gig platforms for work once they arrive in a foreign city. Gig platforms augment existing infrastructure both technologically and commercially, and this is where we want to end then, namely in terms of capital accumulation. Although not usually associated with the state-governed apparatuses of managed migration, gig platforms are increasingly taking on an important macroeconomical role as absorbers of migrant labor. Because they do not have gig workers on their payroll, their onboarding or hiring practices are highly compatible with the speed of migrant mobilities and influx of new migrants. Furthermore, as investment vehicles for capital looking for potentially high returns, gig platforms likewise absorb global flows of finance capital. Crucially then, what links gig platforms' ability to absorb both migrant labor and finance capital is how they leverage data. Datafication, on the one hand, allows for the algorithmic management of migrant gig workers at scale, while on the other hand, it allows platform companies to deploy this data for one, the optimization of its operations, two, the development of new products, and three, the sourcing of new funding rounds from investors. Because investors, after all, they love data-rich companies, tech companies, and gig platforms have managed to promote themselves as such for about a decade now. But where does this data come from? Well, of course, it's captured from migrant gig workers once they logged on to their app. And this is an involuntary process of what we have called in another article, dual value production, wherein the monetary value of the service provided, so of delivery or cleaning, is complemented by the use and the speculative financial value of the data produced during the gig. So the mechanisms of exploitation and commodification that support capital accumulation in traditional migrant-dominated industries, the traditional migrant division of labor, right, low-road, low-wage industries, are in the gig economy augmented by, but also predicated on, platforms' extractive operations. And now I refer operations of capital from Sandro Mazatra and Brett Nielsen's other book. Ultimately then, and now I'm finishing, really finishing, ultimately then, the platformization of migration infrastructure results in the financialization and assetization of migrant labor, whose data generating potential renders it a valuable asset, promising an ongoing influx of investment from shareholders looking for big returns at the moment of a company's IPO or acquisition. While migrant labor has, of course, as many of you probably know, been previously subject to financialization, as when migrants' remittances become incorporated into financial markets, never before has this process been mediated by platform companies whose rigid fealty to shareholder interest and money hemorrhaging business models, because they're losing massive amounts of money, pose a direct threat to the livelihoods and well-being of migrant workers across the globe. Because as an asset class, migrant labor may have financial value, but as a workforce, it is, in the words of another interviewee, composed merely of disposable objects. Thanks, and sorry for undoubtedly having gone over time. Stop the share of the screen, yes.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I'm sure all of you have many questions percolating. Please start putting them in the chat. I'll do my best to sort of collate them, and we'll use them in discussion when we're done. Thank you for that really insightful presentation, Niels. Okay, in my order, in my list, it looks like we're going to hear from Karen McCallum next. Karen, can you share your slides?
Yes, thank you, Jenna. Okay.
Thank you.
There we go. So, to extend Jenna's introduction, I was very happy to be at the University of London last year, and I've had the pleasure of being at Ryerson for the last 12 months. So that's where I'm speaking to you from today, well, from my virtual office in Toronto. So the purpose, this is a lovely sort of lead-in, I think, from Niels and Darsana's research, because I'll be speaking primarily about, well, exclusively about the Canadian gig work sort of scene. So I'm going to be speaking about the Canadian Employer-Employee Dynamics Database, which is a new resource that us as researchers have, that Statistics Canada has made available to us only in the last year and a half. So we'll be really taking a deep dive into what gig work is like in Canada right now. And the work that I'm presenting is coming off of sort of a secondary research and some primary analysis of this data set that I did with Al Ziegler and Rehana Noshiravani late last year. So, got two screens here. Next slide over. No. Sorry. Hopefully we go smooth the next time. So what do we know about Canadian gig work? So in 2019, drawing from administrative data and the 2016 census, StatsCan released a data-driven methodological framework for defining Canadian gig work. So this new source, as I mentioned, the Canadian Employer-Employee Dynamics Database, which I will refer to as SEED from now on, is a matched data set. So it looks at firm level data and individual level sources from tax data on characteristics of people filing their taxes. So it's a collated longitudinal data set and draws from these various files. So release of this data set allowed us for the first time to sort of from a data-driven administrative point of view, define what a gig worker is and separate gig workers from self-employed individuals. So previous to having this database available, it was very difficult to comment about the human capital and the characteristics of gig workers in Canada. So this is very exciting. So we can now say that gig workers in Canada can be viewed as unincorporated self-employed workers. So like a sole proprietor, almost like a self-employed business owner, they report business, professional, or commission self-employment income, but their future business activity is uncertain and is expected to be minor and occasional. So these are people who would file T2125 tax forms, but they do not have a business number. So this is really critical, as Niels was speaking to. These are people who have some of the characteristics or acting like self-employed people, but who actually do not operate a business, and that's a very important distinction. think we'll speak a lot about that today. So here we go. Okay, so on the slide, we can see that there are two, so this is a slide of the percent of annual change in the proportion of self-employed workers who are doing gig work. So we can see there's two big bumps on this graph. This corresponds, well, in 2009 and 2013. So we can see that gig work's involvement spiked dramatically with the entry of gig work platform operators into the country. If you can see in 2009, the gig economy increased from 6% to 6.8% of, sorry, I think I said of the total self-employed population, that's of all the workers in Canada. So that means this orange line is showing the percentage of Canadian workers who are doing gig work. So you can see it's jumped. And we can also say this is corresponding obviously to economic downturns, and that's really important as well. So this spike corresponds to the global financial crisis, of 2007, 2008. And it's also corresponding to the downturn that took place in Canada in 2013, where the dropping prices of oil, the 2013 US debt crisis, rising national debt, weak global markets led to a decrease in the Canadian economy, a downturn. And we see an uptick in the proportion of people doing their gig work then. So the seed shows us there is a spike in income. And in addition to this, the seed tells us there's a spike in income derived from EI benefits, so employment insurance in Canada, the year prior to entering gig work. And then it's followed by a drop after entering gig work. So we can see that now because we have tax data. And EI eligibility criteria brought together with this data suggests that for many people entering gig work, there's a period of unemployment, financial precarity, we would say financial distress prior to starting gig work. So while, and it's really important to think about gig work decisions as autonomous, as Niels was pointing to, we also do have this evidence that shows there's a decision to enter gig work, and then there's also a constraining of choices that allows people to be making such a decision. So we have this economic kind of push into gig work potentially. And other studies as well, one by Kustas, has also found the signs of financial distress for US data. Okay, so what this slide is showing us is characteristics of gig work in tax data. So I think that this is important for looking at the data from a migration angle, because we can see that the enormous proportion of people doing gig work in this country, they're Canadian-born people. So that's at the very top of the chart. Orange is women, blue is men. I think men have dropped off from my legend, but blue is men. So and we can see also that, interestingly, there's definitely a gender element to this, again, as Niels was pointing to. While 70% of gig working women are Canadian born, only 64.3% of gig working men are Canadian born. So if you're a Canadian born gig worker, you're more likely to be a woman. And we see, but in contrast, we can see in all of the migration categories, it's more likely for you to be a man. So if you've been in Canada for 20 years or more, 10 to 19 years, etc., you can read that men are more likely to be doing this gig work. So we'll come back to this because there's sort of questions again. We see more gig workers are Canadian born, but then we'll come back in a few slides to the prevalence of migrants in gig work. So kind of keep this in mind. Okay, so we're going to talk now about income. We know also from this database that the average annual income of someone in the gig economy in Canada is low. So the median net income for a gig worker in Canada in 2016 was $4,303. So far from an income, a main income. We also do know that gig workers make a wide range of incomes. So only 5% of gig income earners net more than $45,000 a year. So correspondingly, that means 95% of gig workers make more than $45,000 per year. This is really important for asking questions and understanding what it means to be earning. Is this your main income? Is this supplementary to your income? So this data gives us a little bit more information about that. We also know from this data set that the prevalence of gig work is twice as high in the lower 40% of income earners than the top 60%. So that means that the less you're earning overall across all kind of income sources, the more likely you are to also be doing gig work. So we also have sort of a signal there that gig work is augmenting an insufficient income, rather than being a a decision to do this as a primary income source for most gig workers. So we're going to get into a little bit of data here, so this might scare people, but if this slide has not already scared you, then you're fine. So we see that men and women both we see that men make more than women in T4 earnings and in gig earnings. So that's the orange bar here is men's T4 earnings, and the yellow line is men's gig earnings, so higher on both accounts. And we also see that when men enter the gig economy, they experience a bigger spike in earnings. So the blue line is women start making money in gig economy, yellow is men. And we see that after 5 years, men continue to make more money than women in gig work. You see the yellow line stays above the blue one. But after 5 years, women tend to make 5% less in their T4 affiliated work than they did before entering gig work, and men experience a greater drop of 8%, a drop in their T4 income. So what we're looking at is the orange bar for men is for 5 years. No, here was my. There we go. 5 years prior to gig work, we see at the end of 5 years after gig work, men's T4 income has dropped a certain amount, 8%. And for women's, if we compare 5 years prior and 5 years after, there's a smaller drop in their T4 income. So anyway, the point of that is to say that overall, women's incomes, if they enter gig work, rise higher than men's ultimately when you add together gig work and T4 income. So while men's incomes after 5 years of entering gig work rises 1%, women's income is able to rise up to 8%, or on average 8%. So what this says to me is that gig work provides a significant economic opportunity for women in particular, which might be understood in the context of barriers faced by women, maybe greater barriers faced by women in traditional workforces. So there's definitely kind of a large economic advantage for women in the gig economy. So hopefully we can pick that up in our discussion later. Okay, so now we get to prevalence again. So we know from American data that the gig work population, in the gig work population, racialized people and new immigrants are overrepresented in the most precarious and least well-paid gig jobs. So this is sort of what we talked about earlier, cleaning, antisocial hours of couriering and driving and things. So what we can see here is that there's a high prevalence of immigrants within the gig worker population. So that means that while there are many more Canadian-born people who are doing gig work in terms of numbers of people, there's a much higher proportion of the overall immigrant population that are doing gig work. So for instance, men who have been in the country in Canada for less than 5 years, we're looking here, or in Canada for 5 to 9 years, they're almost 2 times more likely than a Canadian-born person to be doing gig work. So because immigrants face a wide array of barriers to employment in the traditional economy, not faced by Canadian-born people, it is unsurprising we would see a higher proportion of immigrants working in gig work because of an inability to acquire or sustain T4 work, so traditional kind of employee-employer relationship. And this leads to this prevalence. And obviously, we can also see that gender matters here. So assuming that people make economically rational decisions, we can see here that for women, there's a high degree of economic benefit from gig working. So we see in particular with people who've been in Canada for 20 or more years, women are more likely, actually already in Canada for 10 years or to 19 years, women are already overtaking men in terms of gig work prevalence. And what that might say to us is that women are unable, after even that much time of integration and certainly gaining PR status and permanent residency in Canada, are still finding that their economic opportunities are greater in gig work than traditional work, which I would love to talk about later. Okay, it's our last data slide. So this is industrial distribution of gig workers. So This is sort of extending a little bit what Niels and Darsana were doing about when we talk about gig work, I think it's easy to think about couriers, cleaners, kind of these more visible forms of gig work because we see them all the time, you know, bright pink, backpacks and stuff on some of the courier drivers. But this is showing the industrial distribution of gig workers from the data. So we actually see that we have the highest proportion of gig workers in professional, scientific, and technical services. So that would be sort of what Jenna was speaking to. That would be web designers, short-term consultants, hiring a team from India to do your data crunching for cheaper on research data set or something. We also see, so that's by far the largest proportion of gig workers. And then we see healthcare and social assistance comes in as second. That's really, really important. We'll speak more to that in a second. So cleaners are included in the administrative and support waste management category. And you can see that there's some surprises in there and some that are not. One that always surprised me is the growing proportion of people in construction. There's a lot of gig workers working in construction, which was news to me, and maybe isn't for some people. Okay, so we can see, for example, there's a lot of, we also know from another data set that professional, scientific, and technical services is the greatest across all occupational categories in Canada. That's where we see the most immigrant gig workers. So we know there's a lot of immigrants in particular in the professional, scientific, and technical services fields. And we don't actually have access publicly to data that would allow us to do a crosswalk looking at who are kind of breaking down gig workers by immigrants at this level. I would love to be able to show you a graph that said, what are the top gig working fields for immigrants in particular, but I don't have the data yet. So that's kind of, I wanted to keep it dense but brief. So that's most of my presentation. But what I would like to kind of highlight to bring up for discussion later as well is in particular this high prevalence of gig workers in healthcare and social assistance. So we kind of got already signals from Niels' presentation that gig work is not as good as T4 work in terms of health and employment benefits, as well as paid sick leave, parental leave benefits. The autonomy and the choice that people have to enter gig work is important. It's critical actually for sort of making up, augmenting incomes. But while gig work serves this role, it would be really wrong to suggest that gig work represents a viable and equal alternative to traditional forms of work, especially since we know about the financial distress that people are in before they get into gig working. And I really, really want to highlight, because I have this platform, the stark kind of example given by healthcare and social assistance. When we have that many people gig working who certainly do not have access to healthcare and sick leave in the context of a global pandemic, I think we should be really highly aware that there's people who are highly financially incentivized and in incredibly precarious situations who are really on the front lines and endangering themselves and others through not being able to take time off if they have an exposure, if they are unwell. We know that in Canada, paid sick leave is not guaranteed with T4 employment, and that's it's a really big issue separately. But in gig work, there is this kind of, I think that it's never been more clear what kind of exploitation is possible within this type of work when we see, people who are literally caring for the whole population and taking care of people without even the most basic kind of social safety net there. So I would like to leave it at that. I will be able to make it to the virtual coffee session later, and I look forward to answering some questions and having a discussion. And that's how I can be reached. And that's the paper that has more of this information in it.
Great, thank you for that, Karen. That was really interesting. Certainly sparking lots of thoughts for me, and the chat is now starting to light up, which I'm trying to take some stock of. So we'll get into some questions for all of you in a few minutes. So let's move on to the next presentation, which I understand, Laura, are you giving the presentation Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. So Laura,
I-
you give me the presentation on behalf of herself and Anna Triandafyllidou. Getting better? There we go. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to our research today. So my name is Laura, and I'm grateful to be presenting our research on behalf of Anna and myself. Our project started in May 2020, and a part of the story, a huge part of the research is to thank the participants and the privilege it was to get to listen to the stories of the migrants that came into our lives. And in order to root that, I want to start off with two stories. To center the voices of the migrants that we're speaking with. So Eli, I spoke with him, and this is one of the quotes that really stood out to me. He said, the normal economy pushed me to the platform economy. That's the reason why I'm working with a platform like Uber. Until I find what I want, until I fulfill my goals, I will stick with Uber because there's no other option in front of me. So, and it goes on a little bit, but Eli is a Canadian citizen as of 2019, and he was a professional working globally until he arrived to Canada. And while he was so proud to be in Canada and really wants to contribute, he realizes that these labor market barriers that he was facing pushed him into the platform economy. He was working retail for 2 years, and he realized this was not something that he wanted out of his life, and he could do more, which he stressed repeatedly to me during our interviews. The second story I want to somewhat contrast is John. He is an immigrant through the economic stream through the Canadian immigration system. So it's a merit-based point system, and he immigrated from Nigeria in 2016, and currently, as of July 2020, full-time employed. And he started Skip the Dishes, which is a food delivery courier job, in 2018. And he was doing it full time until recently. He no longer uses it full time. He does it on the side. So for him, when he spoke about the platform economy, he said, for someone who's a new immigrant, I would say if you could get on the platform economy for the first couple of months when while you're trying to find your feet, you should, absolutely. And he goes on to say, it's like an anchor. Perhaps it gives you a sense of, well, I'm here and I have something. So underneath those stories, there's obviously a lot of differences in terms of their stories, but you can also sense a sense of similarity. Highly qualified, educated individuals who are wanting to contribute to the Canadian labor market. They both acknowledge that they are aware of the challenges facing them as immigrants in the new country, but they weren't aware of how hard it would have been, and it is still currently. And while John seems to have a good stepping stone into full-time employment, it could be said that Eli is still waiting for his opportunity, which sets up the context for our research. So from our title, if we talk about a stepping stone, but I think when we explore this topic, it's more than that. It's not just, is it a stepping stone or is it a trap, but there's a lot of intricacy. And also I think we needed to understand subjective experiences of our interviewees, and in addition with their objective reality on the ground. So in terms of income, in terms of their settlement experiences, what is that really like for them? So we pay a special attention during our research on the feelings of control, security, as well as how they're assessing their employment on platforms and whether they feel that platform work enables or restricts their choices and future plans. So Karen already set up the context for gig work. I'm going to just dive into a little bit more about particularly what our research aimed to do. We study platforms specifically, which is similar to what Niels earlier talked about earlier, but these are work that is a service or that's enabled through a digital labor platform intermediary, like an app. I don't want to spend too much time into this next section here, but I want to illustrate some of the background information around the Canadian labor market. So many notable challenges face migrants, but I think it's important to have an idea of what these challenges are. And these are just some of the challenges and how platform work emerges out of these challenges and how it becomes a variable in the economic integration journey of new migrants. We are seeing very highly qualified, educated individuals coming to Canada, facing these challenges that we highlighted earlier, and I will go into a little bit more detail shortly. Our design is exploratory study. We use a grounded study approach in order to understand the lives, the experience, the thoughts, and the various factors and considerations that is needed to build a theory around why do migrants enter into platform work. We started our research during the pandemic, so we weren't able to meet them face to face. So we had conversations through video conferencing as well as phone calls. And our demographics included individuals who arrived in at least for 1 year in Canada. So they lived in Canada for 1 year and worked at least 6 months on the platform. And they were conducted mostly around the GTA as well as in Vancouver. And the first piece of our findings I want to go into is the structural factor of what are we seeing in terms of perception and what's reality for the migrants that we were speaking to. So on the surface, it could seem that platform work is good work because it's so easy and low barriers to entry, or it can just give them the flexibility. But underneath all these positives, in the sense, when we heard from our migrant stories, we also heard a lot of half of our respondents saying that this is not good work. It's just because this is better than any of the other alternatives available for me in the Canadian labor market. So we heard that from Eli, who, because he struggled to find a job in his field, that made Uber such a welcome part of his life. We also want to note that in our interviews, the typical migrant profile we have is male, and it's a man. He is an economic migrant, so he enters through the likely through the point system and with permanent residency, and he has full socioeconomic rights to technically work anywhere he wants. He is facing important barriers in finding a job that matches his education and his qualification and his skills, but he has gone through the relevant need procedures in order for credential recognition. And he is acutely aware that what hampers his labor market integration process is this quote unquote lack of Canadian experience, which we can talk about a lot more. So the barriers that migrants are facing here, and from our interviews, really highlight how platform work becomes so much more attractive. The second part, structural factor, I want to discuss a little bit about is the role of ethnic networks. So this is an interesting one because platform work itself is super individualized in terms of you're alone, you're doing the work mostly by yourself. But our study shows that there is a role of networks that's important here. And it becomes a lever to assist migrants to find a job upon arrival, yet at the same time confining them to the low-skilled niches of the labor market. So from this quote here, you can, it's a woman I interviewed, she said, a lot of people in the Turkish community that I met when I came here, I saw that they were doing Uber and they told me the pay is usually like $25 an hour. So here you can already sense that these are through referrals that the migrants who are working on platforms are understanding how the intricacies work. What's the best time, the inner workings of the platforms, even how much money they're making, even though that number seems high at times. That's what they were told in terms of their communities and how many hours they should work in order to make that money. So there is a role of social capital here that we're seeing in terms of the migrant settlement experience and how it crosses over with the economic integration. The second piece of our research is around the migrant agency role. And it is important to note that migrants in their assessment of the labor market situations are not simply making calculations on expected cost and benefit of working on platforms, but they're also at the same time assessing how to navigate through the labor market so to fulfill their goals. And there's some inherent tensions, and I want to explore that through two frames, which is through security and also through control or lack thereof in both situations. Security. So although fundamentally precarious, platform work emerges as a safety net for some migrants that we interviewed, almost like a welfare system on the side. For this example here, I want to read this quote out for you. But always having an Uber on my side gives me a kind of security. Not secure, but kind of security because I can pay my insurance by working 3 days. Or I can pay my working 7 days, even though I earn a little bit. So it allowed this participant that we interviewed, it gives them a psychological effect that there is some safety net. If I just put in enough hours, I can do it. So interestingly enough, I don't want this to be a rosy analysis of platform work because as Niels mentioned earlier, these practices of gig companies are predatory and exploitative, and there has been researchers that have been studying this. But from our analysis, it was very informative for us to note that the contradictions that we're hearing and seeing in terms of security and what, because the Canadian labor market, in a sense, gives them so little security, ironically, Uber becomes a secure option. Versus insecurity. So on the flip side, the very flexibility of platform work makes it this main shortcoming. You are having to constantly make cost-benefit analysis from the decision to work, when to work. So here in this example, this woman I interviewed said, sometimes you don't really make a lot of money. Sometimes you don't really get a lot of orders and there's no surge, so you hardly make $100. It was just that. First thing is you're paying your own oil, your car oil, your insurance is your own thing. So she's savvy. She knows what surge prices are, when they are coming, which area to work in. Yet at the same time, she's succumbed to the whims of the platform algorithm that is allowing her to be very frustrated and sad as she is experiencing this work. And she still feels defeated by the platforms. And the second piece here we want to talk about is control. So how do migrants find agency and what's in their control? So we use the framework of recuperation and resilience. So recuperation is more a sense of how do they find solutions within their own problems individually with their available options. So what we saw from that is migrants constantly evaluating which apps to use, who they were talking to in order to learn the inner workings of what is successful for a day's work. So these are all solutions that are constantly evolving and they're learning on the spot. Secondly, we want to talk about resilience as well. So here is an action that seeks to subvert or disrupt conditions in which one finds itself. So that's our definition of resilience. And really interestingly, we heard from migrants who were involved with the Fedora unionizing efforts. And I know someone was mentioning about that earlier, and that is a huge role. And this is from one migrant worker who was involved with that process. It's constantly trying to change his work environment, understanding that this is something that is unfair and he doesn't enjoy about the job, and he is actively seeking resilience around it. So we found that is very interesting to note as well. So just two concluding thoughts. So I want to summarize quickly that a couple of points that we made at the beginning. Just truly how the Canadian labor market barriers really highlight the attractiveness of the platform economy. So you have this lack of Canadian experience, we have overqualification, and just these struggles to find a job, which ties into many issues that we still need to uncover and discover. So how is that leading to the role of platforms, and which leads me to my second point. What's going to happen next in terms of with COVID, with the recession, as jobs are becoming harder to come by? Would more migrants come into platform work because out of necessity? So these are things that we have to be vigilant about. In terms of the contradictory nature of platform work, I want to stress again, these inherent tensions that we keep hearing throughout the interview. So security, insecurity, control, lack control. And it was very interesting to note how these migrant workers have to become entrepreneurs in a sense in order to find their way to make money and make it work for themselves. And lastly, want to stress again that migrants in our interviews that we were fortunate to interview are not passive subjects. They're constantly evaluating how to enter the labor market, how to make the best out of their work, and they are actively seeking agency within the framework that they have. And on a note here, our research doesn't right now today touch upon some of the precarity in terms of the gig work, the platform work, and the gig companies that are exploiting workers. And there's a lot of issues around that, as we can see from the UK, from Europe, from Amsterdam, Paris, from Canada. There's a lot of issues going on. And I know we didn't stress enough about these issues right now, but this is not a rosy analysis of how gig work is. And I just want to let you know that we just want to give a voice to the migrant workers here, and not fall into for us to forget that these are gig workers are precarious as well. And lastly, I want to add on this note, I think there is an increased call for what platform work should and could look like in Canada and the world. Just on February 20th, it was the UN Day of Social Justice, and there was a call for social justice in 2021 in the digital economy. And that's something we really have to note. What are policy implications that will have? Are migrants coming to Canada increasingly seeing survival jobs as being the platforms and being the best alternative that they have? what's the role of unionization going on? As we saw from some workers who are involved with respiratory unionization, what is the role of migrants going forward? And lastly, with women and platform work, as Karen touched upon earlier, I think this is a very important area that we need to look into the gendered aspects of women in platform work. And with that, I will conclude our presentation and welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Laura and Anna. That was also really enticing and stimulating. And thank you for ending on questions, which is makes my job a little bit easier. But actually, there's no shortage of questions in the chat, as we already know. You know, in thinking about this, I find it particularly stimulating because I'm thinking about some earlier work I did in 2005 to 2008, looking at the migration industry, just around agricultural migrants, but also around caregiving migrants, and how, you know, existing online platforms then were popping up to facilitate, you know, hireananny.ca in that facilitative role, right? And so there's some interesting layers there and ways to conceptualize some of these things, because there's certainly been changes and particular growth in the last decade that's, I think, changed the landscape, right? From the sort of earlier conceptualization of just this migration industry that was going to be their role, or as part of the broader migration industry as conceptualized by, you know, Sorensen more recently, and sometimes even thinking about their role in governance, you know, as actors de facto engaged in governance, as platforms to migration or brokerage for migrant workers trying to not only navigate employment but navigate immigration systems, right? And so I think there's some really interesting crossovers there for us to discuss, and certainly I have lots of ideas and things I want to hear about. But from looking at the chat, there's a number of things that have resonated. Now I'm maybe a bit behind because there was a lot happening right at the end there. So maybe I'll do one round of quick questions now. So there's some specific questions to particular people, Niels and also Karen, and I think what we'll do is I'll ask the questions, flag when there's been a person named of particular interest, but you can all weigh in if you feel that you would like to. Specific questions directed at Niels were questions around undocumented workers, and if how engaging with the platform, how undocumented workers can engage with that, whether or not it's actually pushing undocumented workers out, or is it a place for them to be able to engage because it's more formalized potentially than had been in certain other areas. And similarly, other questions, there was 2 or 3 questions around undocumented migrants. So maybe each of you could comment on that. Another question that was cross-cutting that I saw, or a number of them pop up that you actually addressed at the end a little bit there, Laura, was around organizing and unionization and the role of the union. You know, one of the challenges that we've long had is migrant workers, those with precarious status, whether on temporary work permits or without status, tend to be in those occupations with high degrees of informality, right? And so this is one of those potential occupations, and the range of kinds of occupations is really challenging when you're trying to talk about this, right? Because you could be talking about those in, you know, web designing, or you're talking about those delivering skip the dishes, right? And because it's all part of this larger bucket of things we'll talk about as the gig economy, right? And I think that's really interesting. But the questions that people raised there was, what opportunities are there for organizing? What cases have there been? Someone flagged the recent decisions in the UK, and I know there's been decisions about Uber drivers in other contexts, and like to hear your perspectives on that as well. Would be great. And then finally, I guess one other, a couple more specific questions that were for Karen were things like, Emily actually wanted to know, you know, what was, and this kind of connects to the undocumented workers, which was she's assuming that the data set that you're looking at and seed in particular is going to be undercounting gig workers because they won't necessarily have filed taxes. And Anna flagged T4s, by the way, our Canadian way of talking about is the tax forms that you need to start submitting. So wondering, maybe reflecting on that as well across each of you. And then I have some others, but why don't we start with that? And maybe why don't we go in reverse order and head back? So we'll start with you, Laura, because you're right here and ready to go.
Sure. I'll start and then Anna, jump in, please. So I think I want to talk, there's a couple of points regarding undocumented migrants. For our research, we didn't actually, well, I think that one of the interesting part of our research was that we were, while our call was very open, we found migrants who entered through the economic stream most of the time, express entry. We're seeing very qualified migrants, which is somewhat shocking and surprising for us as well. So I think that point I won't touch on as much, but in terms of the role of organizing, I think that's huge. However, we are not seeing as many migrants in that as well. And one of the interviews that we conducted, they even said that it almost seems like there's a divide between what the native born Canadians are doing in terms of organizing, as well as what the migrants are doing. And they were really encouraging that there should be more migrants. They want to see more migrant faces in unionizing. So I'll start with those two. Anna, is there anything you want to jump in on regarding the points?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and thank you all for very interesting questions, Jenna, and from the chat. Actually, in a way, I have a question or comment also for Niels. It was very interesting for me yet to hear. So clearly, in the context of at least our work with Laura, we didn't find anyone who is undocumented, properly speaking. So we had refugee claimants, so what would be in European jargon asylum seekers. So people who would have temporary status, including international students or temporary foreign workers. But we didn't have anyone truly undocumented. So the question that is very interesting, and I hadn't come across, because everyone talks about the low barriers, like I think your interviews talked. So it's easy to qualify and you do everything online. And it had not occurred to me that you could do everything online, but the platform is not legally responsible for your paperwork. So if your paperwork is not okay, you're still legally responsible, whether it is for tax purposes or in relation to your stay or work permit. And this is an interesting issue that brings us to the other case that Laura also mentioned, the question of unionizing and recent court judgments. And there again, that's interesting. Is this a good or a bad thing? In Canada, Foodora was, how can I say, I mean, there was a sentence favorable to the workers and the union they had created and against Foodora, and Foodora just closed shop in Canada and left. But if the cases, if the court decisions, and we had recently one decision just a month ago at San Diego Supreme Court in the United States in California, and just one a few days ago from the UK Supreme Court in the UK, from the UK Supreme Court. So Foodora can afford leave in Canada, but what if these court cases become common in all the countries? Now, either we see a development of platform work or we see them closing shop. And I think there was a question from the chat, what is our suggestion? And my suggestion, I think, or Laura's suggestions of, Laura presented one paper that we've done, and we're currently finishing another paper on this issue, is that we need to be creative. I mean, technology is not going to go back. We're not going to stop using the platforms. So we need to be more creative in terms of the welfare and the labor market, the labor contracts or the labor relations that platform work represents, rather than say, oh, we want to stop this, because it's not going to stop. So we really need some new types of welfare. And I wonder whether the pandemic, and for instance, the fact that in Canada, platform workers have been covered by the emergency benefit given normally to dependent employees who lost their jobs under the pandemic. So maybe this is, this was kind of a push to fall in the water and swim for our welfare systems. And just the last comment and response again to a question from the chat about frictional unemployment, and or some other comments. What is, and Laura talked about it, what is the role of this work on platforms for migrants and their labor market integration? Yes, it may seem controversial. Actually, the title of our paper is it the stepping stone? And indeed, for many it is. For many it is for the good reasons, because they use this while they're working, doing their papers to get their professional qualification, for all, because they are multitasking. And we know, well, maybe all workers, many workers, but certainly migrant workers tend to multitask. So this comes in handy because it's so flexible, and everyone praises in our interviews the flexibility. On the other hand, we do find that a lot of people are just stuck with this kind of work. And this is both an objective and a subjective appreciation. So an objective appreciation of whether people are actually doing something. So I'm working on Skip the Dishes or Uber or Helpling, but am I truly doing something else during that time to change my labor market situation or my education? So that's an objective appreciation of this, but also a subjective one. Am I discouraged, or am I like go, go, go? And actually we had people who are students work, say, at a restaurant, as an employee, plus Ubering, which of course is not an ideal situation, but I think there's something there to be said about agency and about the role of networks. And I'll stop there. Jenna, you mentioned, yeah, that's very interesting. And it hadn't occurred to me that we need to look back at those platforms and how they relate. But it's also interesting because one thing that we ask people, and Laura maybe can talk about it later in order not to monopolize, is how did they get into the job? So what is the role of recruitment in the informal sense? So I recommend the job to someone else because I think that's a good starting point, and I'll stop here.
Niels, want to go ahead, or Karen, I guess? Karen and then Niels.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. So just a few things to follow up from what Anna said. So gig workers were supported with employment insurance during the pandemic, but it's also the case that self-employed workers have never been included in EI before. So because of the pandemic, it was the policy decision and the general will of Canadians that self-employed people should receive income support through this pandemic, but that's not usually the case. So to speak to the undocumented issue, gig workers who were supported with income support would have only received that income support if they were, thank you, Anna, in the chat, and basically income support is the EI, that only people who had filed their tax documents, who had filed the T2125 self-employed forms, but were gig workers, did not have business numbers, only they would have received income support. So anybody who was not filing their taxes, any gig workers who were undocumented in that sense would not have received income support, to my knowledge. And sort of in addition to that, in terms of undocumented workers, I don't anticipate that many undocumented workers would have been captured in the SEED database. So that's a gap. There isn't, to my knowledge, good data in Canada about undocumented gig working yet. I also wanted to throw in there, absolutely, the Foodora decision was really interesting. And then their decision to leave last April was kind of telling. So I'm going to put in the chat a very good podcast that a journalist has done about the Foodora organizing. So it's sort of a play-by-play of the unionizing activities that went on. So I'll share that because that's really interesting. And they have a lot of interviews with the unionizers. And then also to put on our radar that just in June 2020, I believe Ontario courts agreed to hear a case against Uber. So Uber has just, in London in the UK, I think that's what we were just speaking to, Uber has just been found to be employing people, sort of a violation of what they say they're doing. And that will go to court in Ontario within the next couple of years as well. The alleged misclassification of workers in Canada or in Ontario rather, for Uber. So that was just given the go ahead, and we'll find out what happens. We don't know what will happen. Maybe Uber will leave. I absolutely agree with Anna that
these opportunities, these platforms are not going away. So there's really a need to figure out if there is a way for them to stay in the country in a way that is economic, but also social benefit to workers who would engage with them. I'll leave it there.
All right, so Niels, go ahead.
Yeah, so about the undocumented workers, right? I think that was the main question, and I kind of I want to say a couple of things about this, also kind of a historical perspective as far as we can talk about the history of gig work, past 10 years or so. So the way I see it, what also comes out of my research is the following. If we want to do a simplified historical trajectory, right, development, you first had what we have called in another paper, me and Julie Chen, the golden days, or the so-called golden days, where these gig platforms, and again, everything I'm saying is specifically about the ride hailing, food delivery, cleaning, the service work, place-based service work, not virtual labor, not Upwork. Let that be very clear. So in having said that, these companies were given so much finance capital, they were flush with finance capital, so they could enter these markets and cross-subsidize, keep the prices low for customers, and have huge, because you have to mediate supply and demand, balance supply and demand. So they also paid really outrageous prices. I talked to people in New York doing food delivery for about $25 an hour. Right, or sometimes more, and they got an iPhone in the very early beginning. Uber gave them an iPhone. So anyway, so that's resulted in a huge influx of all kinds of workers, especially also just like white Americans and white Europeans. Right, in the early days, also in Deliveroo, they were just hiring people as employees, and they were like students and white Dutch people, white German people in my cities. Right, so that was the first step. And then you saw a period that we would call maybe retrenchment or austerity, where all of a sudden they had to show a road to profitability to their shareholders, so they started doing cost cutting. What do you see then? Prices still remain low for customers, but the fees, the paid for the workers goes lower and lower and lower, and this working conditions get worse and worse and worse, and they're all of a sudden all independent contractors, which again is an opportunity for some. We'll get back to that in a moment, but for a lot of people they leave. So what you see, white labor leaves, national labor, like people, citizens of the country, they leave. Who comes in? Immigrants. And then when it gets even worse, what you see is, because there's still like kind of an attraction to it, also undocumented immigrants come, for instance, in the US or New York, especially from Central American countries, and in the Amsterdam context, especially people from Albania and other Southern Eastern European countries that are not allowed, they're outside of the EU, so they're not allowed to work in the EU, but they still come there. They get on other people's accounts. So there's a huge sub-market in also on Reddit trying to sell accounts. So there's the influx of undocumented migrants. And now this is really important. Why is this allowed? Aren't they checking? Yes, they should be checking. They're legally obliged to check, but they are still needing to scale, and they need to win these markets. But the white workers and the national citizens have already left. So they need new workers. So they're willing to turn a blind eye. And they have been turning a blind eye. Like Relay in New York has turned a blind eye, Deliveroo, Uber Eats have turned a blind eye, or they work with shady middle companies, labor market intermediaries that turn a blind eye, so they're not responsible. Now, that is where now we're currently on the cusp of that moment, and now their new moment, which is kind of maybe the regulatory battle moment, right? The awareness moment. Everybody starts to clasp their pearls and be like, oh my God, we need to do something about it. This is a direct threat to all these companies, because if they would be regulated as such, that would mean that they would operate as a regular low-wage employer. And that's not what interests investors. So that's the end of their business model. And they already lose money, but that's just the end of it, because then also finance capital comes in. Because they're not making money with the market, they're not making money on the capital, on the market anymore, on the finance capital. So then that's the end of them. That's why they're pushing $200 million in the Proposition 22. It's insane. Like, that money could have been spent on others. And then the final point I want to make, in this third moment, which they're cleaning up their act, and they have been cleaning up their act for a while, you see a purge. And the undocumented go first, because now they are checking. They are checking, and they have to show that they have their stuff in order. So they purge people as well. And if they have to re-regulate and be employers, then migrants will be the first, especially undocumented migrants will be the first to go. So it's a Pyrrhic victory then, ultimately, for some people.
Thank you for those, well, not so positive comments there towards the end in terms of where things are looking, but I think you might have a good read on it. One of the questions coming up in the chat that I'm also thinking about is around, and you kind of ended on this, which is, what is the role of government? What is the role of the, regulatory frameworks around this? And I think particularly in terms of labor rights, of course, and things like ability to collective bargain, any kind of regulation around wages, those kinds of things, but also thinking about these many platforms as being the first point of encounter that migrant workers will go to also be able to secure employment, both from abroad and then within Canada and within various countries of destination. And there's some work that's been done on this by I think Daniel Bélanger, and looking at the use of cell phones in different countries to meet up with sort of platforms, to connect up with platforms in early stages to be able to find work, right? And so as recruitment platforms, and in particular the role of those recruitment platforms, I think is really interesting as well. And we've seen in that area that the governments have failed miserably at regulating online recruiters, right? Historically. And so what evidence do we have that they can do anything in terms of regulating these kinds of platforms, and whether they're the type that are labor brokers or those that are like Uber or any of these types of businesses? I think it's a good question that people have asked, because we don't have historical evidence of it working just yet. So love to hear all of your thoughts, and maybe we'll go back in reverse order. This will probably be our last question, and then we can give you each a minute to do, actually maybe one of you answer the question and then do like a minute of whatever wrap up, and then I'll reverse order back to Laura. So go ahead, Niels.
So just to be sure, the question was?
The question was about what can regulation and governments and what can they do? Yeah.
I also see Anna saying maybe Darsana wants to come in. Just to be sure, we communicated and we first said that I would answer this, but indeed, maybe now Darsana wants to say something in there as well.
Great.
No, I just have, I don't have a concrete suggestion on how policymakers can better the situation. But one of the things that we noticed is that platforms' intervention in how they exacerbate the precarity that migrant workers face has a very weird relation with the unequal legal footing that migrant workers are already at. So they are already at a disadvantage when it comes to the kind of worker protections that they get, the kind of welfare protections they get, and the access to the labor market that they enjoy. So when we already start with this unequal footing, it's kind of difficult, especially when it comes to regulating gig economy, to come up with policies that cover all workers, because policy making usually focuses on the ideal or the common worker, which is usually the documented citizen. And a majority of gig workers who are migrant workers, and a portion of it which are undocumented workers, fall through the cracks, and they lose access to an alternative employment opportunity that is in many cases, as we saw in our sample as well as in Laura and Anna's study, a valuable opportunity for them. I guess if Niels wants to add something.
No, that's a really great point. Exactly. Maybe I want to add, if you want to properly regulate gig platforms, you have to both treat them as something that is already in existence, namely a low-wage labor market intermediary, but also acknowledge that there's something different, that they're a platform, that they rely on datafication and on the assetization of that data, right? And that they are also highly financialized companies, right? And that depend on finance capital for their survival because they're not making any money. So they have a hugely unfair advantage vis-a-vis other other companies in these low-wage labor markets. The problem is if you then start to regulate them as a low-wage service, labor market intermediary as an employer, what happens then? My worry is that then they either start to, the worst case is that they leave, right? Like Uber can leave now in the UK, or they stop, or maybe they completely dissolve, as I just suggested. What happens to all those people then, right? So my point is we should not focus on the gig economy in terms of regulation and policy. We should raise the bar across low-wage labor markets. That also takes care of the suction, right? The attractiveness of this gig work. So we should really intervene more broadly, because the gig economy is a symptom of misery of migrants and struggles on these low-wage labor markets, and it's not the cause of it, right? It's a perpetuation, but it's also kind of a symptom. Final thing maybe is that, again, if you regulate them, also regulate them as highly financialized companies. So also look into how they're, maybe block some of the ways that people can invest in them. So you have to also turn to the financial market. Because you usually don't have to do that maybe in other with a regular low-wage employer, but these companies are very much less beholden to the state and much beholden to global flows of capital, which the real problem is that those are not regulated. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so going back in reverse order, I guess we'll hear from, now I've lost track of who went where. I think it was Karen, so.
Good stuff. I'm not going to repeat anything that Niels said, although I would have said the same thing. I guess what I will do is I'll take a moment to point to the fact that we will, I forgot to say this during my presentation, we are going to see a massive uptick in gig work in the coming years. The next data set that we have access to, we're going to see that many more households have turned to this opportunity because that's what has always happened in the past. We see financial distress, we see an uptick in gig work. Because we're going to see that, it's imperative that we actually get on this now before we're in recovery period. Because again, as we've all mentioned, this is not a living wage. This is not actually a viable income support for a family who's lost income in the traditional economy. It's it's like it's a bit of a poverty trap for many people. So I think one of the things we can do is potentially think about the ways that we can support Canadian business actually. So this is kind of an idea that just came off the back of Niels speaking to what happens if these companies leave. I think from a macroeconomic perspective, it's not necessarily the case that gig platform operators are of benefit to citizens or the country's economy necessarily, if this is actually coming at the expense of closing small businesses. So if Uber is putting local taxi companies out of business, or Airbnb is putting hotels out of business, that isn't necessarily what is right for workers or what is right for the economy. So potentially there's a role there in strengthening small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada through additional supports that would not be extended to platform operators who ostensibly do not employ people, although they do. So that's one opportunity. And another piece to this is, which I think we've flirted with through all the presentations, is there isn't good enough integration of skills of migrants of all types into the Canadian workforce. So this is not really a good first option, but it's the best first option. So there's a lot of work that we could be doing to ensure that when we do have more migrants coming, and the Canadian government has announced that they're going to increase express entry populations coming through. So these are skilled immigrants who are getting visas to come on a kind of expedited basis. We're going to have more migrants next year, and we're going to have more people doing gig work. So we need to make sure that there's jobs for people, there's businesses for people to get jobs in. So I would kind of throw those things into the pot.
Great. And then now to wrap up, maybe Laura and Anna.
Okay, I can go first. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, many interesting things. The gig economy is a symptom, right? Yeah, I think that's very important to remember. Yeah, the gig economy is not the cause; it's a symptom of a wider cause. But I I want to remind us, or I don't know, Niels and Darsana, if you remember this, I mean, I came across this in a different project, which was about severe exploitation of migrant workers. There was an ad some years ago in the Netherlands that said, you want a cleaner for your house? Here you can find one, €2 an hour. And when you clicked on the link, it said, do you think someone can work for €2 an hour? It was actually an ad to raise the awareness of people that not everything that looks cheap is okay, and not everything is legal. Actually, it was also about trafficked labor. So I think that's one thing where we need some awareness raising of us as consumers, which brings me to the second point. These platforms have created demand. It was some demand that wasn't there. So there were a lot of things that we were not, I mean, and forget COVID, before COVID even, we would go to the, I don't know, we would, some services we would do ourselves, and some services we would find the worker differently. But we need to take into account this, that this is now there. Likewise, Helpling is there to find a cleaner, and Uber is there to get a ride, and Amazon is there to buy not only books, but a lot of other things. And I don't think we can say, we're going to close this, we're no longer going to make it available because this is not good for the workers. Personally, I resisted for many years having a cell phone, but I had to give in. The world wouldn't go back, even if I didn't want to have a cell phone. So, and the third thing is this different sectors of platform work. So I think we can divide between services that require trust, like caring, and also to some extent cleaning, to the extent that you're going to a person's home. And then impersonal services like courier and, you know, all sorts of deliveries, or also Uber, you know, taxi services. And I think there maybe the services that require trust are less amenable to this total gamification of platform work, where I think what these platforms, as you said, Neil, have brought in is how did they increase their profitability and reduce costs by these various digital tricks through which the Uber driver gets more money if there's high demand, less money if there's is less demand and a lot of supply. Which was all new to us as consumers and to us as workers as well. So I think there's something to be said that trust services will be easier to regulate because people will want to know who is the carer. For impersonal services, this is more difficult. And I'll conclude by saying, for instance, there is a lesson to be learned. I have worked a lot myself on migrant domestic workers and undocumented migrant domestic workers. And for instance, one way that there was an effort to get this economy into the surface was through vouchers. So it was a way because the employers were families. And no matter what we say about workers' rights, and Karen, I'm all with you that we need to make this good work possible. But no matter what we say, families are not employers like companies. And there was no way, at least in Europe that I know better, that the families would pay the full welfare cost of a worker. But what most countries came up with were different types of schemes and systems where some welfare was paid that families could afford, and that was easy. You didn't need to go to an accountant to organize this. For instance, one way was a voucher. So instead of paying the worker with money, you'd buy a voucher online. Actually, initially it was in the bank, but quickly it became online. So out of, say, €15, €12 were for the worker, €3 were going automatically for their welfare, for unemployment insurance. I don't think it was pension, but it was health and unemployment. So these are some ways in which we can try to regulate the platforms, because Niels, I would resist the idea that if we regulate them, they're going to close. Because I don't think they're going to close, and I don't think we're unable to regulate them. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
That's for the discussion later in the coffee break.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, as a reminder, everybody, don't forget, you can stay online, stay on the Zoom call if you need to step away, you can always like turn your camera and your mic off, just stay online, and then you can take part directly in the coffee break, which takes place after this. So Laura, did you have any other additional comments?
Well, I just have one thought to end on. It's tying everything that's been said. I think I totally align with everything. It's important for us to pay attention to who pays the cost for our convenience. And I think that motivates our research constantly, is someone is paying the price, and it's think about who it is. And the stories that we've heard time and time again just stress they wish they, I think that in terms of policy wise, what can the government do in terms of settlement agencies? What information would be so important for migrants to know before they come to Canada? I think there is a role for better information channels as well. So yeah, I think, and I mentioned most of the points I wanted to bring into here, but yeah, this work I think just needs a little bit more regulation, and it's, even though it's hard, and just in our own individual part, what can we play as well?
Thank you very much. I think that's a really good way to end it, to spark our conversations over the coffee break. So please join me in thanking the presenters. I really enjoyed all of that. I'm sure each of you did as well. There were many, many attendees, I think about 90 of us. So please feel free to reach out in the chat, to just speak up. My understanding is that now we can, you can have a short break if you need to, but we can transition right into the coffee break. So thank you very much, everybody.